So that brings me to another question I had. The question is about if you had any views, and again, this is obviously just like your personal perspective. You're not a medical professional, you don't know everything, but I'm just curious if your personal perspective gives you any potential insight into the issue of people who are like batshit crazy, people who really seem to have lost the ability to function in society, who, you know, when people talk about stuff like this, the response is often, if you're doing anything other than ascribing to mainstream psychiatric orthodoxy, people will inevitably come out and say what you're doing is dangerous. There are people who cannot function without these drugs. By even mentioning the idea that this might not be a problem that should be solved through medicine, you are being dangerous. So do you have any perspective on what causes people to really go far? Like, you know, when you see people shouting on the street who haven't bathed in months, who seem incapable of functioning, what do you think about that, or do you think anything about it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a related point because I think, like I was saying, when you shut these parts of yourself out, they start to take on these other expressions. But if you shut people in society out, they might well do the same thing, because if you can't, I mean, one thing that people seek above anything else is attention, in whatever form. I mean, it's best to get it in an affectionate, loving form. But if you can't get that, at least if you can get some kind of reaction, just someone acknowledging that you exist, that's what people need. And if they can't go through, no ordinary channels like through their friends, that it starts to come out in other ways, up to the point where they're screaming at people on the street, just to try to get people to notice them. So that's one possible explanation. And yeah, leading on to another point, if you don't have someone to support you during a difficult time and lead you gently back to a path that's a little closer to normality, as my friends and my family did for me, then you get lost, and that's what I assume happens. But every situation is unique, so I can't say exactly. But those are a couple of ideas.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I tried to set you up in as unbiased a way as I could, but more or less, I 100% agree with that. I think that that's what science is showing us. Again, to go back to that talk of the woman who hears voices, that's kind of along the lines of what she said, which is that, first of all, the worst years of her life, the worst her disease got was when she was treated for it. And what it sounds like happens is that when the experience isn't dealt with properly, it can lead to spiral situations, to like cascading situations. And I think your insight was really interesting, because alienation is, as many people know, like social alienation is supposedly one of the most damaging experiences to your psyche. I think I've even heard that our body almost responds to it as like a kind of death, because when you're not part of a society, you might as well not be alive from a genetic standpoint, from an evolutionary standpoint, and your body reacts accordingly. So whereas it might have sounded simplistic or really out there when you said, when people are disconnected, they try to get attention in all kinds of ways. I think that's actually a very scientifically verifiable point, and it is what science is showing us, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, if their body thinks that they're basically dying because they're being isolated, then they're going to reach out. They're going to reach out in whatever ways they can. And if their mind is functioning in a slightly different way already because of a different neurochemistry, those two things could combine to have a really toxic effect, which could then create a negative feedback loop where you spiral into this situation. And with nobody there to help you out of it, to guide you out of it, things could just get worse and worse and worse. And somebody handing you a drug and lying to you about what it's going to do and the effect it's going to have shouldn't help. It's not a surprise that doesn't help much, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. So,
Yes.
I mean, I completely agree with that. And it's interesting to see that as somebody who had a personal experience with that, that's how you came, that's the conclusion that you kind of came to.
Another point I should mention is, of course, I've spoken rather unfavorably of the psychiatric and psychological profession here, but an important point is I do think that psychotherapy can be very helpful, because in my case, the psychologist asked me these probing questions about what I believed and what I thought, and being able to speak freely, more or less without judgment, enabled me to say all of my ideas, and examine them thoroughly until the point I realized that a lot of them were just delusions, and there was no evidence to back them up.
That reminds me of a really, I thought, key point that you made in your article about therapy being about having somebody who helps you gain self-knowledge, right? It's about exploring yourself, right?
Yes, sometimes even professionals will try to force their agenda on you, or they'll let you live comfortably within your comfort zone, which doesn't really help you and actually boxes you in further. But if you have this freedom from judgment and this incisive questioning, then it leads you to self-knowledge.
That brings me to the last point I wanted to cover, which is the question of logic and mental health. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about my personal experience with that first, and then hear what you have to say, which is that when I was a teenager, I was horribly depressed, as I'm sure many teenagers are. And I tried everything. I've tried therapy. I've even tried, in later years when I went into law school, I tried antidepressants. Everybody wants to prescribe me antidepressants. Even now that I don't have depressive episodes, when I tell them that I just wake up tired, doctors will be like, "Do you want an antidepressant?" Like,
wow.
My last doctor, I told her I woke up tired. She said, "Well, you're probably depressed. Would you like me to prescribe you an antidepressant?" And I said, "No, I'd rather you didn't. Is there another option we could explore?" And she said, "Well, studies do find that exercising outside is probably even better."
Why didn't you mention that first?
I went,
Holy
yeah.
shit. That's scary. You could just... That's how it is in the US? You just walk in and tell them you're tired and they give you a pill?
That seemed ridiculous. I hope it's that most doctors aren't that ridiculous. Mind you, she also told me that my test results came back and I had a vitamin D deficiency. And I asked her, "Well, could that be related to my tiredness?" And she went, "No, you're probably depressed." And then I just Googled it. As I left the office, I just Googled vitamin D deficiency and tiredness. And it was one of the first symptoms of vitamin D deficiency. And I'm just like, oh my God. But anyway, when I was a teenager, I got so fed up with everything that everybody else was saying about being depressed, that I remember I was sitting on my bed one day and I just said, fuck it, I'm going to solve this myself. I'm going to use my brain to figure out what's going on and fix it. And it didn't change things right away, but that was the beginning of when things started to turn around for me. And aside from a couple of episodes in college and in law school, after law school, 0 depressive episodes. I mean, my depressive episodes weren't a big deal. It was just I was bummed and had no energy and didn't want to do anything and didn't want to do work. I had always felt that decision to take control of it and to use logic to solve the problem was huge. And you talked about that in your article about the importance of owning your mental state, of applying reason to the issues you're undergoing. I wondered if you had anything more you wanted to say about that.
Yes, it's a tricky one to talk about, but I do find a lot of the time, of course, logic isn't well understood by a lot of people. I remember when I took a course in logic, a statistic which was mentioned was something like among university students, about 86% don't understand logic, and that's among university students. So you can imagine what it might be like in the general populace. And the problem, I mean, it's not always a problem if you don't understand logic, but it definitely helps, because if you have an idea where you're like, okay, step 1, I feel bad. Step 2, I felt bad yesterday, and your conclusion is I will always feel bad. Well, no, that doesn't follow. But that can be easy to accept, especially when you're in a state that's fragile. So the thing is, logic can give you this little tool which sometimes is helpful, and you can see that no, just because things are bad doesn't mean they'll always be. And you can see, like if you have unusual experiences or unusual beliefs which you devise, you can take them and put them on the shelf a little and look at them a little more closely and see if they actually comply with the evidence and your experience. And if they don't, you can say, well, that actually brings the probability of that proposition pretty close to 0, and you don't need to worry about that anymore.
Yeah, that reminds me of another TED Talk that I watched. It's funny because I don't even really like TED Talks that much anymore, but they're coming up a lot. There are some good ones. There's a lot of good ones.
Yeah,
there's a lot of good ones.
It's weird because TED is like some kind of cult. They isolate you and that's another story, but yeah, go on.
Well, the other video that I saw that this just reminded me of, because again, these are sentences that under certain circumstances somebody might listen to and go, this is utter nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. But in this talk, it was a talk by a scientist, and I'll include a link in the description, and I forget his name. But the talk is about how we did not evolve to see reality. We evolved to reproduce. And it is scientifically verified that we do not sense reality. We do not use our sensory apparatus, our eyes, our ears, to view reality as it is. We use our sensory apparatus to experience the universe in a way that maximizes our ability to reproduce. And one of the points that he made, because I think it was the head of TED afterwards interviewed him and asked him about this, is that he said, well, just because we didn't evolve to experience reality directly, we have developed other tools for getting closer, and there is evidence which suggests that logic, the scientific method, mathematics, these disciplines do give us a more direct glimpse of reality. And so there is an actual scientific, rational explanation for why logic can help you through experiences like the one you had. Because like when people think about the experience you have, they go, oh, well, you were disconnected from reality. When the truth is that you watching are disconnected from reality. We're all disconnected from reality.
Yes.
You were disconnected from reality in a different way than we're disconnected from reality. But the truth is that logic, science, mathematics are a way for all of us to recenter, to realign ourselves maybe more directly with reality.